So let's go. I just want to go back a bit. So you've gone through the trauma of your brother. You then have to, I suppose, get on with life. So what does that look like? You go back to work. Just talk us through what that looks like, and then, if you can, link it to the point where you went, okay, I've got to change everything, which is
Yeah.
probably at the beginning of when you came to the Detox Barn.
Yeah, very much so. So, I mean, in terms of what life looked like, I had a 3-month-old baby who'd been seriously ill. So I had to follow a routine, and I couldn't just bury myself and cry and sob and, get up and, do whatever. I had to look after a child, which I think actually really saved me, because I had this,
Yeah,
the needs of a newborn.
yeah.
So, but what
I
did
actually felt
happen?
quite similar, Emma. When I
Yeah,
was sick, it's different, but when I was sick, I had a newborn,
yeah.
and I was really in the throes of my autoimmune disease, and actually that one thing really kept me going. So I totally relate. It's different, but I relate to that.
Yeah, because you can't stop that. You
No,
can't, you
no,
can't, you
and
can't
they
take a
don't know
day.
anything about it.
No, and you
They're
can't take a
they're
day off.
they're
You can't take a day off sick from that.
no,
You know, that's
absolutely.
that's an absolute constant, and a joy and hard work, but also
Yeah,
it's a purpose,
yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it? It's a purpose. So I
Yes,
think, when you're
yeah,
going through this change in identity, which I'm sure you relate to when, you got sick, and what that means for you and maybe your career. It's like, okay, well, this gives me a purpose and a role and an identity that
yeah,
that I that I can't get away from, even if I wanted to. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, also my job relocated during that period. So, I mean, literally, when I was on maternity leave and Brian had just died, my job relocated. So I ended up having to move house to somewhere where I didn't know anyone. So I was an absolute sad sack with no mates, away from my family, bereaved with a sick child, with my husband back at work. I mean, it was an absolute shit show. And
Yeah,
so how I dealt with it was I went back to work. I went back to work
yeah,
earlier than I needed to. I carried on working, and then I sort of went into this cycle that I can now observe, looking back, of working, moving house, working, moving house, having another child, moving house, working, getting promoted. I just sort of went into this mad kind of. I mean, I look back on it now and I want to weep, sort of just to say, "Oh my God, Emma, stop!" But I couldn't. I couldn't. I
mm,
couldn't.
yeah.
It's almost
And
like a form of avoidance.
100% form of avoidance,
Yeah,
none of it conscious at that point, but you can look back on it and I think it's probably quite classic. You could apply a lot of cod psychology to what was going on. So, yeah, and I ended up then moving. I was in an air traffic radar centre for 11 years. I ended up finally being able to relocate to somewhere nearer home, so I could be back nearer my family and have our commuting much easier, and have my support network back. That took 11 years for me to get back into the area I live in now. And I became an air traffic controller at Gatwick Airport, which was, the best place I'd worked. I loved it. It had been my dream job. It had been always the place I'd always wanted to be. So I ended up then, so this is 11 years after, God, no, sorry, probably about 7 years after Brian's death. And then, like, ostensibly, I've got 2 kids and I'm working at Gatwick and everything's, ticking over. And things had started to settle. And it was then that I started to get really ill. And the first thing that happened was I started to have a balance disorder. I got out of bed one morning to go on what's called a familiarization flight, where you go in the flight deck, and enough time had passed
I
since
was
9/11
just
that we
about
were
to
allowed back in
ask.
the cockpit as air traffic controllers at that point.
You're right.
So used to do a lot of work with pilots. Obviously, they would come into the air traffic center. We would go into the flight deck so that we could understand each other's environments. And I got up to go on this flight and I literally hit the floor. I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And I had labyrinthitis a few times before, which is a horrible ear virus that just makes you all over the place and like you're drunk and vomiting. And anyway, that transpired to being quite a serious ear issue, and I ended up losing 40% of the balance function in my ear. So I just kept getting plagued by these weird things, and I was like, my body. There's a great quote which I think might come from "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk. I don't know if you know that
Yes, I
book,
know that book.
but
Yeah,
it may or may not come from it. I may be misdescribing the quote, but it's "Listen to your body when it whispers, so you don't have to when it screams."
mm,
Now, I love that quote because my body was
yeah,
whispering, or rather probably talking quite loudly, and I just kept going and kept going and kept going. But this thing, I mean, I was off work for 6 months. I couldn't stand up, I couldn't walk properly, I couldn't go into supermarkets, I got sensory overload, had to do months of vestibular rehabilitation therapy. It was extraordinary, not something I'd ever heard of, but I managed to kind of get myself back, carry on working. And what was happening alongside that was the anxiety started to mount. And so I'd never suffered from, I didn't really know what anxiety was in that sense that we know about it now. Again, this was quite a while ago. And I just used to be anxious and not sleep and start to have like heart palpitations and have like what I now recognize would be a panic attack. And I would catastrophize. And, you know, there used to be this phrase in my house like, oh, it's all ruined. Like, so if something would happen and I would go into like, oh my God, it's all ruined, it's all ruined. And we joked about it, but that's classic catastrophizing. It would be something small would just set me off into this ridiculous spiral. And coming back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, when I went into work and put on my air traffic headset, I was like, oh, thank God, I'm calm. I don't need to think about Brian's death or Belle's birth or the anxiety or the illness or any of that. I put my headset on and I'm kind of in my safe place, in my happy place. And I know so many controllers who've said the same, that comes their safe place. But what happened eventually is I just started to think, right, okay, much as I feel like controlling is a help to me, what if my anxiety pushes through and I make a mistake? What if I'm not fit and I make a mistake? What if I do something in my, you know, my responsible role in public safety? And I just thought, okay, it's too much. And I will never forget, it's how my book opens actually. I will never forget the night. It's 3 a.m. and I was at Gatwick overseeing the whole domain of the airport. It's fabulous doing night shifts at an airport with all the lights and everything, and you're basically in control of everything and the other controllers are on rest breaks or whatever. But yeah, I just sat there and I just sort of just felt within me that I don't think I can do this anymore, because if I make a mistake, the consequences are too severe. So I put my headset down that morning and called the doctors and sort of held my hands up and said, help me, I'm drowning. And that was it. And then I never controlled aircraft again. I lost my license. I was put on medication. I was diagnosed with severe anxiety and depression and all these things. It was extraordinary. I was like, I'd heard of depression. And again, this was 9 or 10 years ago. It was not discussed in the way that it is today. And nobody in my family had depression. And I was like, well, I'm not sad. I'm not down. You know, it was weird. It was like, what's depression? I didn't understand any of it. But the fact that I couldn't really function, that I couldn't move, that I don't know, it suddenly all started to make a lot of sense. And I learned so much about the brain chemistry and then how we support and help that with our actions and our diets, and all those sort of things came much later when I was started to recover. But yeah, at the time I got this diagnosis and I just remember feeling guilty and thinking, well, what right have I got to be depressed? I'm not on the breadline. I'm married. I've got healthy children. I'm this, that, and the other. I've got a nice house in Surrey. You know, I don't get to be depressed. But the psychotherapist that I saw was very much like, you know, you are a textbook case because you've been avoiding and running away from trauma for years, and the body keeps the score. And this is it. You're now, you can't keep going.
So it's amazing, isn't it? Like how it will catch up with you. You know, the body keeps the score. I think that might be Gabor Mate.
No, it's not. It's Bessel van der Kolk. It is. Yeah, yeah.
He's
They're not similar. Yeah, I mean, we've interviewed him, and he's they're sort of very similar themes that go
something very similar. Yeah, about. So you had to leave air traffic control. So what happens next?
So I had to leave being an operational air traffic controller, but in the way that I am, I carried on doing other roles, and I went into senior leadership and ended up working for the aviation regulator, and kind of went back into this cycle of doing more and getting promoted and doing more and getting promoted. So, you know, it's like, where is the learning, Emma? You know, and I think those around me would be a bit like, oh my God, here she goes again. And then I was going off and working in commercial space flight and flying out to Washington, DC and heading up innovation departments and trying to get, you know, flying taxis in the air and all this kind of stuff, and just doing all this crazy, crazy stuff, which I think will have been when I met you. So I was in that role when I came to the
Yeah,
Detox
that's
yes.
right.
Barn.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I
that's where I
think
was.
just to say, I think Emma, so many people can relate to that cycle. I know that I've been in that cycle before of just sort of running and creating a new show and pitching a new idea and then that not working and
Yeah,
trying something else. And when I look at my friends, I can see them in that as well. I think we all fall into that trap. And it might not be that we're avoiding like massive trauma that obviously that you'd experienced, but I think when you're running a lot, you are avoiding something. So it's good that you finally stopped. So tell us, you came to the retreat, and that was the beginning of you sort of going. Had you decided to leave by then?
no, I hadn't. And do you know what? I also think a lot of this running and this drive, it's very societally constructed because, we are so
Yeah,
in the Western framework obsessed with identity. You go to a party and it's like, what do you do? And probably at the
yeah,
Detox Barn, it's like, I'm Emma and
yeah,
whatever I said that I did, so you feel like, and when everything else is falling apart and, I don't have a sibling and I don't have this and I don't have that. Well, I do have a sibling, but I don't have that
Yeah.
sibling,
yeah,
then I think you sort of come back to, but I'm an air traffic controller and I'm successful in my career. So that's the thing I'm going to cling on to at the expense of everything else. The rest of
yeah,
my life might fall to shit, but I'm going to cling on to that because I need to. And I think doing things like the Detox Barn is where, what's so great about the Detox Barn, I think, I'll mention that you haven't paid me any backhanders to say this, but, just to be there and to have the digital detox, which you encourage without forcing it, but just to have that space and to think, right, okay, and to be outside and to start to notice your surroundings and to look at your body and to see how flipping knackered you are. Because, when I turned up in that state, in that stress state, when I left 2-3 nights later, I was in a completely different state of mind. And whilst I think, it's unrealistic to, it's like that holiday happy, you can't maintain that because you've got to go home and deal with life and kids and admin and you've got to earn a living. But I think you've got to take away, how can I find enough of that? And how can I make space for enough of that to keep me well? So I think that's when I really started thinking, okay, I've got to make a change. And I started to get quite ill again not long after that. The anxiety rose again. I started to have severe panic attacks that following year as we were leading up towards lockdown. And then the thing that again then changed it really was going into lockdown, because it was another obviously forced reset. I'd been off sick again quite a lot prior to lockdown, and I was just like, what am I doing with myself? I mean, really, what am I doing with myself? I arranged to take a sabbatical from my job. And during that time, I retrained with my sister, with Brenda, in coaching psychology, because we thought, right, we both do a lot of leadership work in our roles and really interested in people and how people behave and make the decisions they do. And we didn't really know where we were going with it. We thought we'd bring it back into our workplaces, respectively. And then during lockdown, I just had this moment. I was like, fuck it, I'm not going back. I'm not going back. I can't go back. I can't go back into that. It's not good for me. It's not good for my family. It's not good for my marriage. It's not good for me as a parent. It's not helping my relationship with my children because it's so all consuming. And the space that a lot of people found in lockdown, in that sense, I was like, I need to find a way. And it's like the space at the Detox Barn. It's the same sort of thing, but massively extended, and being outside and not commuting and not flying to Washington and not doing this, that and the other. So it was during the lockdown, I thought, I've got to make the change. The only way we could do that financially was to sell our house, which we were very lucky enough to have a house to be able to do that and to downsize. And we managed somehow to do that during lockdown, which was pretty stressful in terms of, virtual viewings and all this kind of stuff. But my husband was so supportive. He was amazing. And the kids, I mean, they were like, oh, I don't want to sell this really nice tree in the garden, in the way that a 6-year-old views the world. And I remember my daughter being distraught because, we were leaving that tree. And I was like, look, it will be fine. And we did. And we sold the house to where we are now, to where I'm sat now. And, the kids couldn't be happier. They love our house. We've been in for a couple of years. It meant I could hand my notice in and really and truly walk away.
I mean, you say that like, oh, we just sold a house. Not many people would do what you did. It's a big risk, isn't it?
It takes a lot of courage to say, I'm going to sell the house in order to pursue my dream. And that's what you did, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's funny. So what Brenda and I then did with our coaching psychology work is we set up a coaching business. So I was like, right, so I've got to have an income. So we'll set up the coaching business, and we love working with people, but also maybe I can write my book. And when I speak to clients who know the story, they're like, oh God, you're not going to sort of try and persuade me to sell my house, are you? And I'm like, well, no, A, that's not how coaching works. And B, it's just so very individual. And I understand and recognize that what I did was probably at the quite extreme end of life changes in terms of leaving a 6-figure job and selling a big house to enable me to kind of really go to very little income and live in the way that I live. And I don't know, it was just one of those clear light bulb moments. My husband and I were having a conversation, and I think it's fair to say we weren't in the best of places at that time, just before we made the decision. And he said something that really struck with me. We were like, I was like, I can't ever leave work. I can't ever leave work because, his job is amazing, but in the fire service didn't pay all the bills and all the mortgage and everything. It's just the way it is, sadly. And so I was like, I'm trapped. I can never leave. I can, and this is what I see with so many of our clients. You just feel like there's no way out. And he said, well, we could sell, well, there would be a way out if we sold the house, but you won't sell the house. And I was like, what do you mean I won't sell the house? I'd sell the house. And he's like, but you love the house. And I said, yes, I love the house, but it's only a house. Of course I'd sell it. And it was so weird. We'd both been going on for a couple of years. Him in his mind, like, well, if only if we sold the house, we could solve this. But she won't even countenance it. But he never asked me, and I'd never thought about it.
But also good on him as well. Because at me, if it was the other way around, I might be a bit like, well, no, you can't fucking leave your job. Do you know what I mean? We've got like this really lovely house for you to go off on a writing whim. No way, just stay in the job. You know what I mean? If I'm being honest. So amazing that he didn't do that.
I think a lot of couples experience that kind of thing, and often it's been in the reverse dynamic because I was the breadwinner, and I think a lot of times, if it was the man having a thing, the woman would be like, what do you mean you're going to leave your job? Of course you can't leave your job. This is our house and our kids, and the kids go to school here, and this kind of thing.
And we could go on Dubai holidays.
Yeah, well, this is it. So all that went out the window. But ultimately, we could see that none of that mattered. I mean, I know it sounds cliched, but none of it mattered. And years prior, when Ian moved from air traffic to the fire service, we took on the roles of me being the breadwinner. And I stayed in a job through some really difficult periods, to enable his career and to enable his career to grow. So it was like 15 years later, there was none of that animosity. He was amazing. There was none of that kind of like, well, can't you just stay and suck it up? Because he was like, no, this is your time and you've done your stuff. You've done your time in the high pressure industry, brought in the income that's allowed us to be in a position that we have a house we can sell. And you're getting sick and there's nothing more that I want for you to be well. And he was like, I don't care. And, it was a real changing moment in our relationship, which had got quite tricky. And, we've been brilliant ever since, because it really was that. It took it right back down to basics. And it was just like, I love you. I want you to be well. And I don't care about the house, and we can go and live somewhere else, and we'll go camping on holiday. And, we don't need any of that shit. I never needed any of that stuff. It just, the more you earn, the more you spend.
Yeah,
I really believe that. You end up with a big income, and then you end up having to pay people to look after your dog and your garden and your children and your this and your that. And, you get into this ridiculous cycle that you didn't mean to. It's never been the way I believe, or my sort of, my way of being. It's like, take it back to basics and I'll be barefoot and, have a holiday in the garden, and it's great.
Yeah. Or you do other things. You go, oh, maybe I can afford private school, or it just all becomes relative. I know that whenever I've earned a little bit more, I just spend a bit more. I just spend a bit more on face cream, or do you know what I mean? Whatever it is.